Now the competition between China and the United States is all round, from political and military to economic and cultural. It is undeniable that China and the United States each have their own advantages. Generally speaking, the United States still has the upper hand in terms of the international situation and national strength. Therefore, many experts have given judgments on the future trend of Sino-US competition. There are optimists and there are pessimists. Optimists believe that China will win. China has strong manufacturing capabilities and the largest market. It is the #1 trading partner of most countries in the world, and its political system is clearer and more united. But pessimists believe that China lacks innovation, aging, and with an unhealthy economic structure and a poor international environment, it is believed that it is impossible to defeat the United States. Of course, China is currently facing many problems, such as high housing prices. Many people joke that industry harms the country, real estate speculation rejuvenates the country, and now real enterprises are facing many difficulties such as the epidemic, and the real economy has begun to shrink momentum. Although the country has proposed innovations for many years, the real innovations are still plagiarizing the existing achievements of other countries. There are very few original innovations, let alone technological innovations. But where are the roots of these problems? In my opinion, the key to the competition between China and the United States lies in the competition of young people. Young people in a country are the most energetic and creative. If young people in this country can be spiritually free, full of dreams, and dare to pioneer and innovate, even if the country currently has many problems, they will be overcome gradually. However, if young people in a country are oppressed by society like walking corpses, are riddled with holes, scarred, and full of negative energy, no matter how prosperous the country is, it will inevitably decline. Therefore, the current problem in China is the excessive squeeze on young people. This generation of young people are all sluggish, so where does innovation come from? First of all, the social burden is too heavy. The current national policy is very clear, which is to drive people from the countryside to the cities to realize urbanization and industrialization. The method is also very simple, that is, you cannot survive farming. The current grain price is basically the same as it was 10 years ago, but the consumption level has doubled several times. Now if farmers rely on farming, the income is not enough to buy pesticides and fertilizers, so they can only go to the city. In the cities, the high housing prices have become 3 big mountains that weigh on young people. They are burdened with mortgages that can be repaid until retirement at a young age, and they are in constant anxiety. Secondly, the family burden is too heavy. First, most young people in cities, everyone is an only child, and they will need to take care of more elderly people in the future. The involution of children's education has caused them to spend a lot of money and energy on their children, let alone young people in rural areas, and the elderly. There is no social security, and they all depend on their children to look up to them. Because of the educational resources they have obtained and the cities are getting bigger and bigger, their inner anxiety can be said to be even greater. Third, the burden of career is too heavy. Now all enterprises are popular in 996, that is, as long as they can't die, they will work to death. Whether it is a delivery boy or a white-collar worker in the company, they are all pushed to the limit by the enterprise, and young people in China today's society is always at the bottom. On the one hand, it is because of cultural traditions, and on the other hand, it is because of the system. You are young, you have to respect the old and love the young, so in the unit, you have to listen to the old leader. The first thing you learn is to flatter and flatter, how to make the old leader happy. The resources you have depend on the leader you stand in line with. In other words, China is a group of middle-aged and elderly people who hold most of the social resources to enslave young people. The group of people who have resources has no innovative ability and motivation. They just want to obtain more wealth through previous accumulation, and these wealth are searched domestically, such as through real estate speculation. This phenomenon can also be seen in the scientific research community. Most of the research and development funds are now in the hands of a few academicians and outstanding professors. They allocate these resources based on their relationship and their own preferences. The United States is different. Most of the research and development funds in the United States are controlled by young researchers or postdoctoral researchers. The older they are, the more difficult it is to get funds. Taking food from a tiger's mouth is harder than cutting off its head. The behavior of those with vested interests is a manifestation of human nature, and they have no mistakes in principle. In fact, Some people used to think that Japan's decline was caused by the real estate bubble. In fact, it is not the case. The moment Japanese young people decide to lie down under the pressure of society has already determined Japan's future. In Western Europe, South Korea, and other countries, the main reason why their development is weak is that the status of young people in society is getting lower and lower, the pressure is getting higher and higher, and they have lost their creativity. Lying flat has become the choice of most young people. The country is bound to decline. In the United States, through immigration and a relaxed domestic environment, the vitality and creativity of young people are significantly higher than those in other countries. This is also the key reason why the United States has been able to dominate the world for more than a century and still maintain such a strong national power. Rebooting won't solve the problem. What we need is to reinstall the system. The young people of a country represent the present and future of the country. We can see the direction of the country's development from the current choices of young people. The current young people's favorite directions are to engage in finance, real estate speculation, and enter the system. To put it bluntly, it is to make quick money and lie flat. If such an atmosphere becomes the mainstream of the times, it will be impossible for China to win the competition. The only way out for China is to let young people become the main force and driving force of the country's development, and make the Chinese dream the dream of every young person. Let them see that through their own efforts, they can obtain basic necessities of life, achieve a well-off life with their own hands, and become a young man with good health, spiritual freedom, and stable material security. Such talents may be creative and have a sense of identity with the country. Only then may it be the foundation of national prosperity. However, the common phenomenon in rural areas is that many young people are idle all day long in the village and have nothing to do. Some experts say that these young people who choose to return to their hometowns did not choose traditional farming in the countryside, nor did they choose to go to the city. Instead of working in a factory, I choose to dawdle, doing nothing all day long, and my beautiful youth is just wasted and exhausted. Are princes and generals better? But there is another phenomenon that in big manufacturing countries like Japan and Germany, the wages of blue-collar skilled workers are actually higher than those of white-collar workers. What the country lacks most is that it has not trained a group of high-tech technicians. There is no light in the eyes of young people. Young people are full of confidence in the future of the country and full of confusion about their own future. Is this normal? I often hear experts say that young people should not rely on wages to buy a house. It is a matter of course. Then he said that young people can't bear hardships and would rather be idle than go to factories, which is the main reason for the decline in the real economy. Since my salary can't guarantee my basic life, why use my hard-earned money? It's better to engage in finance, deliver food, and shoot videos. Maybe it can be popular. China's birth rate, social employment trends, and the development status of the real economy all show that young people in China are already overwhelmed, and the idea of lying flat is gradually spreading like a virus. Another very interesting phenomenon is that the salary of retired teachers is twice as high as that of teachers who are currently teaching. This shows that in general, how bad the attitude of the whole Chinese society towards young people is. The whole society thinks that young people should suffer a bit. What should they do if they give too much money and want to enjoy themselves? There are also a bunch of experts fooling around that China lacks skilled workers, and more young people should be allowed to go to vocational and technical schools. These people send their children abroad for further studies, and they persuade others to send their children to factories.
Logic 有一个 extra
I just
practice.
want to reply, fuck you.
OK?
In the
所以
end,
你
I
你要
quote it
快
from Blanco
OK?
and send it to the young friends to encourage them. Life is like an ant, and you should have great ambitions.
加油，拜拜。
Life is as thin as paper, but you have an unyielding heart. A man was born in the world, how can he live in depression for a long time? The universe is uncertain, you and I are both dark horses. Will the artificial intelligence technology represented by ChatGPT steal human jobs? Lin Yufu, Honorary Dean of the National School of Development at Peking University and Dean of the Institute of New Structural Economics, said at the Boao Forum for Asia Annual Conference 2023 on the 29th that instead of worrying about it, people should actively embrace technological change. In his imagination, with the blessing of artificial intelligence, in the future, humans may only need to work 1 day a week. At the World Economic Outlook sub-discussion held that day, how artificial intelligence affects employment attracted the attention of the participants. Ahmed Saeed, Vice President of the Asian Development Bank, said with a smile that the moderator of the forum may be the last job to be replaced by artificial intelligence, because language, thought, and creativity are the most difficult parts of artificial intelligence technology to overcome. Taking over this topic, Justin Uvalin said that facing the rise of transformative technologies, on the one hand, people will see increased productivity and increased opportunities. On the other hand, they feel that this has brought challenges and threats to employment, jobs, and lifestyles. To deal with this kind of challenge, we can draw experience and lessons from history, Lin Yufa said. At the beginning of industrialization, when people discovered that machines could do better, they also worried about their jobs being replaced. But looking back now, this kind of technological development and progress needs to be embraced wholeheartedly, because the improvement of productivity is the basis of human progress and the improvement of living standards. Lin Yufa does not deny that technological change will cause some jobs to disappear and some jobs to be reduced, but he believes that this also gives people more opportunities to enjoy life. For example, in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, almost everyone had to work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. Now people only work 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. In the future, when artificial intelligence takes on a lot of work, people may only work 1 day a week, 5 hours a day, so embrace this opportunity. In 1962, Chairman Mao asked Liu Deng for his opinion. How long would it take for the food production destroyed by the Great Leap Forward to recover? Liu Deng was in charge of the frontline work of the central government at that time. They said it would take 10 to 15 years, because the enthusiasm of the cotters was dampened by the rectification of the 5 winds. Chairman Mao went to seek Chen Yun's opinion again, and Chen Yun said that it would take 8 years, and proposed the proposal of 3 self, 1 contract and dividing the land to work alone. Chairman Mao did not immediately make a statement, and then went south to inspect the countryside. Passing through Henan, he asked Ji Denkui, secretary of the Luoyang Professional Study Committee, for questioning. Ji Denkui said that grain production will be effective in 1 year and stable in 3 years. The natural conditions of agriculture are just like that and have not changed. As long as the weather is good and the policy remains the same, the harvest will be bumper in 1 year. The matter was resolved, and it stabilized in 3 years. Later facts proved that what Ji Denkui said was accurate and objective. On June 18, 1965, Chen Yun wrote to Chairman Mao, admitting that he had made a mistake in his estimation of the rural situation. In 1962, I estimated that the speed of agricultural recovery would take 8 years for food. The recovery of cash crops was even later. Now it has actually recovered in 3 years. This completely proves that my estimation is completely wrong. At the beginning of July 1962, I suggested to you that it was wrong to use the method of redistributing land to stimulate the enthusiasm of farmers for production. It is related to the collective economy and small peasant economy in agriculture, and the 2 roads of socialism and capitalism. Problem. With the method of strengthening the collective economy, agriculture has been restored in 3 years. If the method of dividing the land is used, it can be considered that capitalism has developed greatly, and the consequences will be disastrous. On the morning of May 27 local time, Zaluzny, commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, posted a video titled "It's Time to Take Back What Belongs to Us" on his social platform account, advocating that the Ukrainian army's major counteroffensive has begun. On the same day, Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council Secretary Alexei Danilov declared in an interview with the BBC that the counteroffensive was ready and could begin tomorrow, the day after tomorrow or within a week. The Ukrainian army announced that the counteroffensive was about to start, and released a video to hype it, but the situation did not seem to be as easy as Ukraine wanted, and the situation was not good for Ukraine. American investigative journalist Seymour Hersh pointed out that some European countries led by Poland are urging Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to end the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Seymour Hersh pointed out, these countries are headed by Poland. They have been privately urging Zelensky to find a way to end the conflict, and even resign himself if necessary. Includes the Baltic and Eastern European countries such as Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The situation disclosed by the American investigative reporter Seymour Hersh also shows that the Russia-Ukraine conflict has reached the moment of final reckoning. The debts owed will have to be repaid sooner or later, and there is no free lunch or Western aid. Ukraine has acted as an agent of Western countries, and is willing to become cannon fodder for the United States and the West to fight against Russia. It can be said that since the day Ukraine chose to get closer to the United States and act as a pawn of the United States in 2014, all tragedies are doomed. After the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Western countries headed by the United States ostensibly stood firmly on the side of Ukraine. In fact, in their eyes, Ukraine is just a consumable used to seek their own interests. The large amount of aid provided by Western countries to Ukraine is not gratuitous. They are all mortgaged by Ukrainian land and other resources, and they are all recorded. Western aid is not a free lunch, and the debt owed by Ukraine will have to be repaid sooner or later. The US budget of $48 billion in aid to Ukraine is about to be exhausted, and all weapons and ammunition supplies have been wiped out by the Russian army. The United States is the most active country in aiding Ukraine, and it is also the direct igniter of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. In order to help Ukraine win the battlefield, the United States has budgeted $48 billion to provide Ukraine with various types of weapons and ammunition. But a year has passed, and the Russian army has exhausted the weapons, ammunition, and supplies aided by the US military. The Patriot missile system received by Ukraine launched 30 Patriot missiles in more than 2 minutes, with a total amount of $150 million, all of which were included in the total amount of $48 billion. The United States has clearly pointed out that the $48 billion is about to run out. In addition to the United States, more than 30 Western countries have also provided more than $100 billion in aid to Ukraine, but it is now time to run out. The $48 billion of the United States were wiped out by the Russian army, and the total of more than $100 billion in aid from the European Union, the United Kingdom, and other Western countries was also exhausted. Although Russia's military expenditure is only more than $70 billion per year, it spent a total of more than $150 billion in the West on the battlefield. Today, the new round of military aid to Ukraine announced by Germany, the United Kingdom, and France is all aid beyond $150 billion. 1.2 million shells, 600,000 anti-tank shells, 9,800 multiple rocket launcher missiles, 655 artillery systems, 1,170 air defense systems, 1,510 infantry combat vehicles, 440 tanks, some fighters, radars, and individual equipment, etc. The West has given out all the assistance it can provide. However, the weapons, equipment, ammunition, and supplies aided by the West were all wiped out on the battlefield. Now Ukraine is beginning to face serious problems of insufficient ammunition, weapons, living supplies, and medical and health supplies. It can be said that everything aided by the West has been wiped out by the Russian army. In the latest bombing, the Russian army destroyed $200 million of ammunition supplies in the West at one time. Western aid cannot withstand consumption. Russia is firing more than 3 times the ammunition of the Ukrainian army every day. As a result, the Ukrainian army consumes more funds than the Russian army. The $150 billion in military aid from the West can be described as a big deal, but what Ukraine can get is really too little. To some extent, Ukraine is just the best target for Western arms dealers to make huge profits. No one can say exactly how much water is in the weapons and ammunition they aid. From the news from the battlefield, we know that billions or even tens of billions of dollars of arms and supplies from the West have basically been consumed without playing a big role in Ukraine. The Russian army consumes 3 times as much ammunition as the Ukrainian army every day, but Ukraine consumes more funds than the Russian army. The United States also raised the issue of the unknown whereabouts of military aid weapons and ammunition, and sent an investigation team to Ukraine to investigate, but in the end it was nothing. It can be said that the West's arms aid to Ukraine is a mess. Members of the US have pointed out that the US aided Ukraine with $10 billion in weapons, ammunition, and supplies, of which at least $6 billion remained in the hands of US arms dealers in the form of profits. The weapons and ammunition aided by other Western countries to Ukraine are also in a similar situation. On the surface, the amount of aid is large, but Ukraine actually receives very little. The United States has begun to ask for accounts publicly, and Ukraine may be completely mortgaged. Ukraine launched a counter-offensive and announced that it had shot down a Russian hypersonic missile knife. However, the actual situation on the battlefield always slaps Ukraine in the face, embarrassing Ukraine, and embarrassing the United States and Western countries. The United States pointed out that the United States is increasingly dissatisfied with the counterattack predicted by Ukraine, because almost everything promised to the Ukrainian army has been given to the Ukrainian army, but the counteroffensive has not yet started. The most difficult time for Ukraine. U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Celeste Wallander said it was time for Ukraine to start paying for U.S. weapons. American liquidation companies have begun to intervene, and Ukraine will really lose completely. The United States began to ask for debts, and Europe also began to ask for debts, but Ukraine now has no ability to repay. The Ukrainian government and BlackRock signed an agreement on the 8th of this month to establish the Ukraine Development Fund. This is the United States preparing for Ukraine's failure to pay its bills. The total national debt of Ukraine is $119.9 billion and there are still many accounts owed to the West that have not been included. Faced with the reality that everything is paralyzed, Ukraine is really unable to pay back its debts. BlackRock's intervention is to annex all assets in Ukraine, such as land, pipelines, grain, minerals, and so on. Hungarian Foreign Minister Zsigmond Péter said Budapest would not support continued EU aid to Ukraine unless Kiev dropped its increasingly hostile stance towards Hungary, Reuters reported on May 17. Laszlo Trotsky, leader of the Hungarian Our Motherland movement, pointedly pointed out, Ukraine has been sold, and war will destroy everything. Ukraine cannot have a future, because everything in it is based on the United States headed by Western countries all over. It can be expected that no matter how the conflict ends, all valuable things such as Ukrainian land, minerals, oil, and gas pipelines will not belong to Ukraine. Ukraine will lose everything, all wealth has been taken by the West. From the moment of the final liquidation of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Ukraine also lost consecutively on the battlefield. Obviously, the Western countries headed by the United States, after realizing that Russia cannot be defeated, began to liquidate Ukraine. According to reports, Wagner has announced that the Russian army has de facto completely controlled Bakhmut, and the Ukrainian army has completely failed. In addition, Russia blew up Kiev's air defense system, and the air defense missiles aided by the West are almost exhausted. Ukraine began to lose consecutively on the battlefield, and the so-called counteroffensive ended before it really started. Even U.S. military officials have pointed out that the counteroffensive Ukraine is preaching may never come. It is undeniable that during the city-building movement in the past few years, through the means of urban investment debt, infrastructure construction, and GDP growth have indeed ushered in explosive growth. Mainstream economists will always use this absolute growth to accuse Mao Zedong of being poor and white and delaying development. In such a growth curve, the long first 3 decades of New China were close to a stagnant horizontal line, which seems to be able to support the views of economists. However, not to mention the planned economic environment of socialist public ownership in the Mao Zedong era, many economic activities were not settled in currency, so water conservancy construction, third-line construction, and many major projects that required hundreds of millions of manpower were impossible to calculate. GDP. Taking water conservancy construction as an example, in the 30 years from 1949 to 1979, the volume of water conservancy project construction completed by the state and governments at all levels was 108.3 billion cubic meters, and the volume of projects completed by the masses work points was 252.7 billion cubic meters, for a total of 361 billion cubic meters. What is the concept of 361 billion cubic meters? The project volume of the Great Wall is 200 million cubic meters, and the Three Gorges project is only 300 million cubic meters. That is to say, in the first 30 years of New China, with the level of productivity and technical conditions at that time, the construction of water conservancy alone was equivalent to repairing 1,800 water conservancy projects. The Great Wall or 1,203 gorges is equivalent to an average of 43 gorges projects per year. The total investment in the Three Gorges project is more than 200 billion. Based on this calculation, the GDP created by water conservancy construction alone in the Mao Zedong era reached at least 8 trillion a year. This does not take into account prices and inflation factors. Huge water conservancy construction is certainly not ineffective labor. Even the mainstream agricultural experts in the 1980s did not dare to deny, they just deliberately concealed and ignored, the importance of water conservancy construction to increase grain production in the Mao Zedong era. Large-scale mountain and river improvement greatly reduced drought. The occurrence of waterlogging disasters has ensured the industrial and domestic water use in many places today, which is a feat for the benefit of future generations. In addition, The scenic spots named XX Lake in many places today are actually reservoirs built during the Mao Zedong era, continuously creating GDP for the tourism industry. And even considering the issue of GDP alone, we might as well list out the growth curve around 1978. 1953 to 1978 GDP growth curve, vertical axis unit, 100 million yuan. 1979 to 2020 GDP growth curve, vertical axis unit, 100 million yuan. It can be seen from the figure that whether it was before 1978 or after 1978, the GDP growth of New China was roughly in the shape of an upper parabola. Among them, in the 25 years from 1953 to 1978, GDP increased by 4.46 times, and in the 25 years from 1979 to 2004, GDP increased by 39.7 times. In the same 25-year span, the growth rate after 1978 was more than 8 times that of the previous one. However, GDP is always a single currency indicator, and we have to consider the impact of actual price levels in different periods. At the end of 2009, Mr. Su Yishan, director of the Commentary Department of First Finance and Economics, published an article Systematic Questioning of CPI, which comprehensively compared Beijing Chronicle Price Chronicle, Shanghai Price Chronicle, Guangzhou City Chronicle Price Chronicle according to the prices of various single items in 1978 inquired on the records and other materials, and the prices of individual items in 2009 inquired on the China Price Information Network. It was found that the purchasing power of unit currency in 1978 was 58 times that of 2009. More intuitively, it is possible to compare the growth curves of major industrial products in 2 time periods. Steel output, 10,000 tons. 1949 to 2018. 1949 to 1978. 1979 to 2018. Coal production, billion tons. 1949 to 2015. 1949 to 1978. 1979 to 2015. Power generation, 100 million kilowatt hour. 1949 to 2017. 1949 to 1978. 1979 to 2017. From the comparison of the growth curves of the output of several major industrial products above, it can be seen that, similar to the GDP growth curve, for a single product, when we fit the growth curves of the entire stage of New China together, before 1978 it looks like it is a horizontal line close to the zero mark line and almost stagnant. This is what mainstream economists call ossification and poverty, are actually close to the high-speed growth curve of the upper parabola. Taking power generation as an example, comparing the average annual growth rate of power generation during each 5-year plan period, the first 4.5 5-year plans in the Mao Zedong era were faster than the latter. In the 30 years from 1949 to 1978, the power generation increased by 58.7 times. In the same 30 years from 1979 to 2007, the power generation increased by 11.8 times. Similarly, in the 30 years from 1949 to 1978, the annual coal production increased by 19.3 times. In the 37 years of 2015, coal production only increased by 6.4 times based on the peak in 2013. It can be seen that the development speed of Mao Zedong's era was not slow, and the mystery of the growth curve is not mysterious. Only literati elites who do not understand mathematics would use the 70-year growth curve to laugh at the first 3 decades of Mao Zedong's era. A 9-story platform starts from the pile of soil. What's more, the new China founded by the Chinese people under the leadership of Chairman Mao actually first filled the big hole made by the 3 mountains of the old society. On the basis of a backward agricultural country, a complete modern industrial system has been established, laying a solid foundation for future development. When we resisted US aggression and aided Korea, we still had a lot of energy and little steel, but by the time Chairman Mao passed away, New China had already a lot of energy and a lot of steel. This ushered in 70 years of peaceful construction for New China. If we talk about problems, the biggest problem is probably too much accumulation and too little consumption, so that the masses cannot intuitively feel the so-called growth dividend from the improvement of personal life. Of course, this issue also needs to be discussed. After all, New China has been threatened by 2 major imperialisms successively, and the international environment in which it lives forces the leaders of that generation to choose this method to grow themselves as soon as possible. A few days ago, the author Sahi Xian, a representative of nationalists, forwarded a Weibo post. It is not surprising that he and supports such a view. Nationalists are not the same as Marxists, they don't understand historical materialism, they don't understand dialectics, and they don't understand problems in a relational and developmental way. It is said that among the 1.8 million households in Shanghai, there are 119,000 households with 3 generations living in the same room, 316,000 households with parents and children over 12 years old living in the same room, and 85,600 households with siblings over the age of 12 living in the same room. This is seen today when the per capita housing area is 41 square meters. It is simply heinous crime. However, the prosperous Chile foreign market before liberation was only a corner of Shanghai. The vast majority of the bottom-level people were either homeless, wandering on the streets, or families huddled in simple shacks built with thatch and leaves. Even in today's Hong Kong, at least 300,000 low-level families of 3 generations still live in cage houses of about 7 square meters, and more working-class people live in subdivided houses with kitchens in better conditions. Although the living conditions of workers in Shanghai at that time were far from what they are today, the workers received fair and free housing in the housing improvement within their capabilities. Under the conditions of the public-owned planned economy, if more construction funds are used for housing improvement, the speed will only be faster. In 1949, with the support of Stalin, Khrushchev of the Soviet Union began to overcome the main technical problems of prefabricated housing construction. Since 1954, a large number of simple houses transplanted from the model buildings of French social housing began to be built in large numbers. Short in just 10 years, about 54 million Soviet people lived in new 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom houses. Such houses are called Khrushchev houses. Of course, their functional layout cannot be compared with modern houses, but at least they were envied by the working class in Europe and America at the time. Khrushchev House. During the third-line construction of New China, those newly built factory and residential areas were already in line with such standards, and the living conditions of the working class were greatly improved, but these third-line factory areas were later abandoned. Abandoned residential area for workers of a machinery factory in the Qinling Mountains. The difference between Shanghai and these new third-tier enterprises is that it itself is an old industrial zone in New China. Many houses were newly built in the early days of liberation. Compared with simple shacks, brick concrete houses are already a great improvement, and the next thing to consider is when to demolish the old and build the new to improve living conditions. Another important factor is that a large number of educated youths returned to Shanghai in the early stage of reform. These new housing needs were completely outside the plan of Mao Zedong's era, which would naturally exacerbate housing difficulties. With the development of productivity level, technical conditions, and material base, it is not impossible to quickly improve the housing problem of the masses according to the development mode of Mao Zedong's era. In 1953, Chairman Mao once pointed out, the capitalist road can also increase production, but it takes a long time and is a painful road. The words are still in my ears.